Imagine spending your 400-year life at the top of the food chain, watching countless new species show up to the Galactic Council, their faces all wearing the same dumbstruck expression. That was Ambassador Keithal's life, and honestly, it was getting a little old. He'd seen it all before. Their clunky, primitive ships would limp into the designated kiddie table docking bays, reserved for species that hadn't earned their place yet. He figured today would be more of the same, but he was dead wrong. Because today, the humans were arriving. A species that had sent their first little signal into the void a measly 50 years ago. That's not even a blink of an eye in galactic time. Keithal's own people, the Valoran hegemony, had been zipping between stars for over 100,000 years. The Kree Dominion? They'd been conquering their corner of the galaxy for double that. Heck, even the newest member, the Tassari Collective, had 20,000 years under their belt. And these humans, with a pathetic 300 years of total spacefaring experience, thought they deserved a seat with the grown-ups. 300 years. The idea was so ridiculous, Keithal almost laughed, but it was just too sad. He turned from the star-dusted window to look at the other ambassadors. All 12 of them, the heavy hitters of the galaxy, were gathered in small groups, whispering. Some looked bored out of their minds. Others had a faint, mocking smile playing on their lips. Not a single one of them was worried. And why would they be? The humans were like toddlers who had just discovered matches. Their technology was a joke. Their ships were slow as molasses, and their weapons were practically toys. The intel was crystal clear. Human ships used basic fusion drives and were protected by simple energy shields. They didn't have a clue about gravity manipulation, dimensional folding, or quantum tunneling. They were, in a word, predictable. Another species fresh from the nursery, rumbled Admiral Vexnar of the Kree Dominion, a massive creature covered in hard scales with eyes that were even harder. His people were born warriors who had devoured half the galaxy before the Council finally put a leash on them. I wonder how long it'll take before they come crying to us for protection. Now, Vexnar, play nice, chided Counselor Mirret of the Tassari Collective, a small, delicate being whose silver skin seemed to glow from within. We were all young once. Not this young, Vexnar snapped back. My ancestors had conquered 3 star systems by the time these humans figured out how to rub 2 sticks together. Keithal stayed quiet, his eyes drifting back to the window. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a strange charge in the air. That heavy silence you get right before a thunderstorm hits. A crackle from the station's intercom sliced through the chatter. Attention, all ambassadors. The human delegation will arrive in 5 minutes. Please take your ceremonial positions. The ambassadors started moving toward the center of the hall, forming the traditional semicircle. When a new species showed up, the great powers always greeted them as a unified front. It was supposed to look like a gesture of unity, but really, it was a power move designed to intimidate. Keithal found his place between Vexnar and Mirayet, smoothed out his ceremonial robes, and tried to force a welcoming look onto his face. It was part of the job. As the ambassador for the oldest civilization in the galaxy, he had an image to uphold. The minutes dragged on. Keithal found himself staring at the window again. Any second now, the human ships would pop into existence, dropping out of hyperspace at the designated coordinates before slowly chugging their way to the station on their old-fashioned drives. It was the standard procedure for every newcomer. It gave the Council a chance to scan their ships and get their condescending welcome speech ready. There, Mirret whispered, pointing a thin finger into the darkness. They're here. Keithal looked. At first, he saw nothing but the endless black. Then, space itself seemed to ripple, like a stone had been tossed into a perfectly still pond. A silent flash of light, a tear in the fabric of reality, and the ships appeared. And Keithal's heart completely stopped. There were 5 of them. By galactic standards, they were tiny. The smallest was maybe 300 meters long, the biggest barely 500. But it wasn't their size that sent a shiver of pure ice down Keithal's spine. It was the way they looked. The ships were just wrong. There was no better word for it. They didn't look like ships. They looked like someone had punched holes straight through the universe. They were covered in a blackness that wasn't paint. It was a deep, hungry kind of black, the kind that swallows light and refuses to give anything back. And they shimmered. The edges of the ship seemed to blur and shift, as if they were vibrating between two different dimensions at once, like they weren't entirely solid. "What in the void is that?" Vexnar hissed, all his earlier cockiness completely gone. Keithall didn't answer. He was staring at the scanner built into his wrist cuff, a standard-issue gadget for every ambassador. It could analyze any ship's specs in seconds: weapons, shields, power source, the works. But right now, it was giving him absolutely nothing. The screen was just a mess of static. Random numbers and symbols flashed and disappeared. A stream of error messages scrolled by. His scanner was trying to read the human ships, but it was like asking a toddler to read a book on quantum physics. It just couldn't understand what it was looking at. "My scanner's fried," Keithall said, his voice tight. "Mine too," Miret confirmed. "Mine as well," another ambassador called out. Keithall glanced around the room. Every single ambassador was staring at their wrist, and every single scanner was completely useless. "That's impossible," Vexnar growled. "Our technology is the best in the galaxy. Nothing can jam our sensors." But something clearly could. Keithall forced himself to look back at the window as the human ships moved closer. They moved with a spooky, silent grace, like sharks gliding through the deep ocean. And as they approached, Keithall noticed something else. The space around them was bent. It was subtle at first, just a slight distortion of the stars behind them, a weird warping of the background radiation. But the closer they got, the stronger the effect became. Space-time itself seemed to be curving around these ships, as if they had a gravitational pull so massive it was bending reality. But they were small, way too small to have that kind of mass. Unless it wasn't gravity. A cold dread snaked up Keithall's spine as a terrible, impossible idea started to form in his mind. "Ambassador Keithall." The voice startled him. He turned to see his chief science officer, a young Valoran named Tethra, standing behind him. She was pale as a ghost and her hands were shaking. "What is it?" Keithall demanded. "I got a partial reading on the human ships," Tethra said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just fragments, really. The data is almost totally corrupted, but I think I found something." "Well, spit it out." Tethra swallowed hard. "The ships, sir, they seem to be partially out of phase with our reality." Keithall just stared at her. "That's impossible." "I know," she said. "No one has ever managed stable phase manipulation. We've had theories for thousands of years, but the energy needed is astronomical. Just doing the math would take a supercomputer 1,000 years." "I know," Tethra said again, "but the data is what it is. Those ships aren't entirely in our universe. Part of them is somewhere else, somewhere we can't see or measure." Keithall turned back to the window. The human ships were now holding their position, waiting silently in front of the station. He could feel them. He could feel their presence like a physical weight, a creeping darkness pressing down on his mind. "It has to be a mistake," he muttered. "A sensor ghost, a glitch in the system. These humans have only been in space for 300 years. They can't possibly have technology that's centuries ahead of ours." "Perhaps," Tethra said, but her tone made it clear she didn't believe that for a second. The station's intercom crackled again. "The human delegation is docking at Port 7. Ambassadors, please prepare to greet them." Port 7. That was a high-security port, the one reserved for the most powerful members of the council. Keithall wondered for a split second who made that call, then pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. All that mattered was what or who was about to walk through that door. The ambassadors nervously shuffled toward the greeting platform. Keithall followed like a zombie, his mind racing. He was thinking about phase manipulation, about the ancient theories his own people had dismissed as impossible fairy tales. A ship that could exist partially outside of normal space would be practically invincible. Weapons would just pass right through it. Shields would be completely useless. The ship could blink in and out of existence whenever it wanted, attacking from angles that shouldn't even exist in our 3 dimensions. And that wasn't even the scariest part. A ship that could access another dimension could theoretically draw on power from forces we can't even see. Forces like dark energy and dark matter. Keithall shook his head, trying to snap out of it. He was letting his fear run wild. There had to be a simpler explanation. The humans were primitive. They couldn't have solved a puzzle that had stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy for ages. The doors to Port 7 hissed open. A dead silence fell over the entire hall. 5 humans strode into the grand chamber, dressed in simple dark suits without any insignia or flair. They looked plain, soft skin, small eyes, with no visible armor, scales, or claws. They were the very definition of a biologically unimpressive species, just as the scouting reports had indicated. But the woman at their head was something else entirely. She was tall for her kind, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that were dark and unnervingly calm. She carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had stared down true horror and made it flinch. As her gaze swept across the assembled ambassadors, Keithall saw a flicker of something he couldn't name. Was it amusement? Pity? Or was it a warning? "Ambassadors of the Galactic Council," the woman stated. Her voice was steady, crisp, and echoed easily through the massive hall. "I am Elena Vasquez, representing the United Human Confederation. We appreciate you granting us this audience." Keithall moved forward, his official duty calling him to respond. "Ambassador Vasquez, on behalf of the Galactic Council, I welcome you. We hope this day marks the beginning of a long and fruitful partnership between our peoples." The words were just a script, a formality he'd repeated hundreds of times for countless new species. But this time, it felt different. Ambassador Vasquez from Earth offered a tiny smile. It was barely there, a ghost of a gesture, but Keithall caught it. And in that instant, he understood. She knew. She knew the Council had analyzed her ships, and she knew their top-of-the-line scanners had found absolutely nothing. She knew they were confused, maybe even a little frightened, and desperately trying to hide it. And she wasn't the least bit intimidated by them. "Thank you, Ambassador Keithall," Vasquez said, her tone perfectly even. "We are honored. Humanity has been anticipating this day for a very long time." 300 years of space travel, another Ambassador Vexner interjected, trying to regain some dominance. "Hardly an eternity by our measure," he scoffed. "No," Vasquez calmly agreed. "It is not." She left it at that. She didn't need to say anything else. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Keithall could feel the other ambassadors studying Vasquez, trying to figure out the source of her unshakable composure. "Your vessels," Ambassador Catherall finally said, breaking the quiet. "They are peculiar." "Are they?" Vasquez replied, her tone one of mild surprise. "Our sensors were unable to get a clear reading on their composition." "My apologies for the inconvenience. Our human technology can be a bit finicky." It wasn't an explanation. It was a masterclass in deflection. Vasquez was openly avoiding the question, and she didn't seem to care that everyone knew it. A flash of anger went through Keithall. In 400 years of service, no one had ever treated him with such dismissiveness. New species typically approached the Council with reverence, almost begging to be let in. They answered every query. They showed respect. They certainly didn't stand there with a subtle smirk and refuse to cooperate. But he quickly smothered the feeling. He was a diplomat. Patience was always more effective than anger. "Perhaps a discussion of your technology can wait," he said, his voice like silk. "For now, let us begin the official proceedings. There will be ample time for questions later on." "Of course," Vasquez replied. "We look forward to it." The ceremonies began, as drawn out and tedious as ever, packed with ancient speeches and rituals that had lost their meaning eons ago. Keithall performed his duties on autopilot, his mind racing. He kept his eyes on Vasquez. She stood through the entire affair with a quiet grace, simply listening and observing. When she was addressed, her answers were brief, polite, and revealed absolutely nothing of substance about her people or their tech. She played the part of a perfect diplomat, appearing cooperative while yielding zero ground. But now and then, Keithall would see her gaze drift to the viewport, to the fleet of human ships hanging in the void. And when she looked at them, her expression shifted. It wasn't pride or even satisfaction. It was something far more somber, something that looked almost like grief. What in the galaxy had these humans seen out there? Keithall wondered. What had they been forced to endure? He didn't know, but a deep-seated need to find out began to grow. When the ceremonies finally concluded, the ambassadors began to disperse. Keithall made his way to Vasquez before she could depart. "Ambassador," he began, "might I have a moment?" Vasquez turned to face him. "Certainly." "Your ships are remarkable. I've studied starship design for many years. I would be fascinated to learn more about their construction." "I'm afraid that's classified information," Vasquez stated plainly, without a hint of hesitation. "But I can assure you they have served us very well." "Against what?" The question escaped his lips before he could censor himself. He hadn't intended to be so direct, but the words were already hanging in the air. Vasquez was silent for a long, weighty moment. Her eyes searched his, as if weighing his character, deciding if he could handle the truth. "Ambassador Keithall," she finally said, "do you have any theories as to why humanity truly ventured into space?" "For discovery, for resources. The same reasons as everyone else, I would imagine." "No." Vasquez slowly shook her head. "We went into space because we ran out of options. We fled to the stars because something found us first, something that hunts in the empty darkness between suns, something that wanted to extinguish our entire species." A cold dread snaked its way down Keithall's spine. "What are you talking about?" "Not here," Vasquez said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Not yet. But soon, the Council will learn the truth, and when you do, you will understand perfectly why our ships are built the way they are." With that, she gave a slight nod and walked away, leaving Keithall frozen in place with a million questions swirling in his mind. He remained there for a long time, staring out the viewport at the human fleet. The ships hung in the blackness like silent warnings, their hulls seeming to drink the starlight. And for the first time in 400 years, Ambassador Keithall of the Valoran hegemony felt an emotion he had nearly forgotten: fear. 3 agonizing weeks had crawled by since the humans' arrival. 3 weeks filled with dead-end meetings, stalled talks, and a mountain of unanswered questions. And through it all, Ambassador Elena Vasquez had given them nothing. Keithall sat in his private chambers, scowling at the pile of reports on his desk. His top intelligence teams had been working non-stop. They'd scanned the human ships with every technology they possessed. They had attempted to decrypt human communications. They had even tried to quietly bribe a few members of the human delegation. It was all for nothing. The ships remained an enigma. The humans were an impenetrable fortress, and the Council's patience was wearing thin. "This is a complete outrage," Admiral Vexnar roared. He was storming back and forth in Keithall's office, his reptilian scales practically buzzing with indignation. "We welcome these newcomers to our station. We offer them incredible trade opportunities and mutual defense pacts, and they refuse to share even the most basic specifications of their technology." "They haven't refused," Keithall corrected him, his tone even. "They have simply sidestepped the question. It amounts to the same thing." "No," Keithall argued, "it does not." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "A refusal is a direct answer. What the humans are doing is far more calculated. They are hiding something massive." "Then we'll make them show us what it is." Keithall eyed the hot-headed Kree admiral. "And how precisely do you propose we do that?" Vexnar flashed a grin, and it was not a pleasant sight. "The Kree Dominion has a time-honored tradition," he hissed. "When we meet a new race, we test their strength. We challenge them to a display of their military capability. It is a matter of honor. You want to challenge the humans to a weapons test?" "I do." Keithall considered it. It was a bold move, but it might just be the only leverage they had. The Council had no legal authority to demand humanity's secrets, but a challenge of honor, that was a different game entirely. If the humans declined, they would appear weak and lose all standing. No emerging species wanted to seem weak in a galaxy run by titans. "Very well," Keithall said at last. "Make the challenge." But tread carefully, Vexnar. I suspect these humans are nowhere near as primitive as they appear. Vexnar let out a derisive laugh. You worry far too much, old friend, he sneered. I was commanding fleets when these mammals were still learning to make fire. Whatever little toys they've cobbled together are no match for the might of the Kree Dominion. He turned and stomped out of the office. Keithall watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He hoped Vexnar was right, but he had a terrible feeling he was dangerously wrong. The challenge was issued the very next day. Vexnar stood before the full council assembly, speaking the formal, ancient words of the right. He called upon the human race to demonstrate its worthiness. He demanded they showcase their military power, generously offering one of his own battleships as a practice target. The entire council chamber fell completely silent. Every single eye turned to Ambassador Vasquez. She remained seated, looking as calm and composed as always. Her expression was unreadable. For a few heart-pounding seconds, she simply observed him. Then, a slow, deliberate smile spread across her face. The Kree Dominion pays us a great honor with this challenge, she said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Humanity accepts. A ripple of whispers spread through the hall. Some ambassadors looked stunned, others looked thrilled. Vexnar just looked smug. Have you ever been the new kid in school, surrounded by bullies who think they own the place? That was humanity on the Galactic stage. We were the underdogs, and the biggest bully of all, Admiral Vexnar of the Kree Dominion, had just demanded we prove our new technology wasn't a threat. Stay with me, because how humanity responds is a lesson in why you never, ever judge a book by its cover. Excellent, Vexnar boomed, a smug grin plastered on his face. We'll hold this little test in the Theta 7 system. It's empty, so no one gets hurt when your toy blows up. Ambassador Vasquez, representing all of humanity, just gave a calm nod. Acceptable. I'll provide one of our own battlecruisers as the target. It will be fully armed and shielded, but with no crew. This is a demonstration, not a massacre. Of course, Vexnar sneered. Bring as many of your little ships as you want. We'll all watch from a safe distance. That's when Vasquez smiled, a real smile this time, with a dangerous glint in her eye that made even the stoic alien ambassadors nervous. Oh, one ship will be enough, she said. The room went absolutely wild. Aides were scrambling, and ambassadors from 50 different worlds were shouting all at once. Even Vexnar, the picture of arrogance, was floored. One ship? He stammered, his voice cracking. You're sending one ship against a fully powered Kree battlecruiser? Yes, she replied, her voice steady as a rock. You do know our battlecruisers are the strongest warships in the galaxy, right? Their shields can laugh off a nuke. Their hulls are tough enough to survive crashing into a small moon. I'm aware, Vasquez said, unmoved. Vexnar just stared at her, his face turning a deep shade of purple before he burst out laughing, a harsh, nasty sound. Fine, human! Send your one ship! I can't wait to see it turn into space dust! He spun on his heel and stormed out, his cronies scrambling to follow. In less than a minute, the huge chamber was empty, leaving just Vasquez and a sympathetic ambassador named Keithall. Keithall cautiously approached her. Ambassador, he said softly, you're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most foolish. Maybe you need to be a little of both to get by, Vasquez answered with a wry smile. But a Kree battlecruiser, that's no joke. It's the product of 30 years of their best engineering. Its main cannon can crack a planet's crust. Its shields have never, not once, failed in combat. I know, she repeated. And you really think one of your ships can take it down? Vasquez met his gaze, and her eyes were as deep and dark as the void between stars. Ambassador Keithall, she said, her voice dropping to a serious whisper, in 3 days, you're going to witness what humanity is truly capable of. And on that day, you'll understand why we're not afraid of the Kree Dominion or anyone else. She then stood, gave a polite nod, and walked out, leaving Keithall alone with a million questions buzzing in his head. 3 days later, it felt like the whole galaxy had shown up. Over 50 ships from every major power were gathered in the Theta 7 system. There were sleek cruisers, massive destroyers, elegant science vessels, and enormous cargo haulers. And in the center of it all, sitting like a king on its throne, was the Kree battlecruiser. It was a true monster. This thing was a 2-kilometer-long beast of jagged black metal, bristling with more guns than you could count. A faint blue shimmer from its shields and a low, menacing hum from its engines screamed destruction. Even empty, it looked like death itself. From the bridge of his own ship, Keithal watched it, remembering how he'd seen a cruiser just like it rip through an entire fleet like it was made of paper. The whole idea of a single human ship facing that thing was just completely, utterly insane. "Sir, the human vessel is approaching," his officer announced. Keithal's head snapped toward the main view screen. A tiny black dot was crawling toward the metal leviathan. As it drew nearer, the dot slowly came into focus, revealing a shape that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. It was the same ship he'd seen before, a vessel that seemed to swallow the light around it, like a patch of darkness cut out of space itself. It had blurry, indistinct edges, a shape that felt incomplete, like it wasn't all there. The humans had named it the Prometheus. "Put it on the main screen, magnify," Keithal ordered. The ship filled the view, and that same cold, creeping feeling from 3 weeks ago returned. It was a deep, primal wrongness that made the tiny hairs on his arms stand on end. The ship wasn't even big, maybe 400 meters long, a rowboat next to the Kree battleship. Its hull was perfectly smooth, with no visible guns, no missile tubes, no shield emitters. It looked peaceful, almost harmless. But Keithal was wise enough to know that the most dangerous things in the universe are the ones that don't look it. "Attention all ships, this is Admiral Vexnar," a smug voice crackled over the open channel. "The show is about to begin in 60 seconds. Stay clear, folks. We've already told the humans we won't be rescuing them when their ship gets vaporized." Keithal could hear the other Kree officers chuckling in the background. They thought this was a joke. They were all waiting to watch some backward species embarrass itself in front of the entire galaxy. But Keithal wasn't laughing. He just stared at the little black ship and held his breath. 30 seconds. The Prometheus glided forward, calm and unhurried. 15 seconds. Keithal's hand gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had no clue what was about to happen, but it felt like he was standing on the edge of history. 10 seconds. The Prometheus came to a dead stop. It just hung there in the void, facing down the monster, the giant and the dwarf, the walking arsenal and the empty shell. 5 seconds. Keithal took a deep breath. Begin. For a moment, nothing happened. The universe was silent. The battlecruiser floated, its shields humming with power. The Prometheus remained a dark, quiet shadow. And then, the space around the battlecruiser started to warp. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight shimmer distorting the distant stars, making Keithal wonder if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the distortion grew stronger, twisting and bending the very fabric of reality. The battlecruiser's shields began to flicker violently, their blue glow flashing to an angry red as alarms blared across its hull. The gigantic ship suddenly lurched, as if it had been punched by an invisible fist. "What's going on?" Vexnar yelled over the comms, his voice now stripped of every last ounce of smugness. "What is that ship doing?" No one could answer, because what they were seeing defied all known laws of science. The Prometheus hadn't fired a weapon. There were no lasers, no torpedoes, no energy blasts. It was just sitting there, reaching out with something unseen, something impossible, something that worked on a level of physics they didn't even know existed. The battlecruiser's shields collapsed. They didn't just fail, they folded in on themselves, imploding as if a giant cosmic hand had grabbed them and crushed them into the ship's core. The blue glow vanished, leaving the warship completely defenseless. "That's impossible," an officer whispered. But the real show was just beginning. The battlecruiser's hull began to buckle and fold, caving in like a soda can being squeezed. Metal groaned and tore apart. Huge gun turrets snapped off like twigs. Engine sections exploded in silent bursts of fire. This incredible machine, the pride of the Crane Navy, the result of 30 years of genius, was being wadded up into a ball of scrap. He had seen stars die and planets shatter, but he had never witnessed anything as terrifyingly efficient as this. The warship kept shrinking. 2 kilometers of advanced alloy became 1. 1 became 500 meters. The ship was folding into itself, crushed by a force that was rewriting the rules of the universe. And the whole time, the Prometheus didn't move an inch. It just hung there, a silent black shape, watching as it unmade the most powerful warship in the galaxy. Then, as quickly as it started, it was over. Where the mighty battlecruiser had once floated, there was now only a perfect tiny sphere of super-compressed metal, no bigger than a shuttle. It glowed with a faint, dying red heat, the only gravestone for a legend. The demonstration was over. The comms channel erupted into pure, unfiltered chaos. Admirals were screaming, scientists were begging for sensor data, and politicians were demanding answers. But Keithall heard none of it. He just stared at that little metal ball, his mind struggling to grasp the impossible truth. The Prometheus hadn't used a weapon. It had used reality itself. It had reached across space and simply told the battlecruiser's atoms to get closer together. It could manipulate the very forces that hold the universe together. Then, Keithall remembered a strange detail from an old report. Human ships were found to exist partially out of phase with normal reality. They were in our dimension, but also somewhere else. A place where the fundamental forces of the cosmos, like dark matter and dark energy, weren't just theories. The humans hadn't just discovered this other dimension, they had mastered it. They had turned the building blocks of the universe into a weapon. If they could do that to a battleship, what could they do to a planet or a sun? A chill colder than deep space ran down his spine. Ambassador Keithall. The voice was Vasquez's, coming through his private comms. Her face appeared on screen. She looked calm, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes, as if this victory brought her no joy. "I trust the demonstration was clarifying," she said softly. Keithall could barely speak. "How?" "For too long, your council has seen humanity as either a threat or a child," Vasquez said. "The truth is, we are neither. We seek peace, but we learned a long time ago that you can't have peace without the strength to defend it. Don't mistake our quiet nature for weakness. That's a lesson the universe teaches everyone eventually." The screen went dark, leaving a stunned silence across the entire fleet. Humanity had just put the galaxy on notice. The entire fleet had gone dead silent. All the smug laughter, the cocky attitudes, gone. In its place was a raw, chilling fear. For the very first time, the so-called great powers of the galaxy had witnessed something that genuinely scared them to their core. And Keith knew, without a doubt, that the game had just changed forever. The council chamber was so packed you couldn't breathe. Every ambassador, every aide, every top brass officer who could cram inside was there. The room was a sea of bodies, and every single pair of eyes was locked on one person. Ambassador Eleonora Vasquez stood all by herself in the middle of the room. Projected on a massive screen behind her was the image of the Prometheus. Its ghostly hull, its bizarre shifting shape that had crumpled a battlecruiser without even firing a shot. Keith sat in his designated chair with the other senior ambassadors, feeling the full weight of a sleepless night. He'd spent hours digging through every report, every piece of sensor data, trying to wrap his head around what he had seen. But none of it made sense. The numbers were impossible. The physics was just plain wrong. This kind of technology shouldn't even exist, and yet there it was. There, ambassadors of the Galactic Council, Vasquez started, her voice steady but heavy, like she was about to reveal a devastating secret. You wanted answers. You demanded to know how humanity came up with this tech. Well, today, I'm going to give you the truth. She paused, letting the silence stretch out and fill the room. Even Vexnar, who had been completely shamed when his flagship was destroyed, was quiet. He just glared at her, his eyes filled with cold, pure hatred. 217 years ago, Vasquez said, her voice dropping a little, humanity made its first contact with life from another world. But it wasn't the friendly handshake we'd all dreamed about. It wasn't a meeting of equals. It definitely wasn't an exchange of wisdom. She tapped a control on her podium, and the image on the screen switched. A cold dread washed over Keith. The picture showed something unnatural. A creature that looked like it was made from a patch of night sky, a tear in reality itself that had been given a monstrous shape. It twisted and moved in ways that just weren't physically possible. It seemed to have too many corners, too many dimensions that folded into each other. Just trying to look at it gave Keith a splitting headache. "We have a name for them, the Umbra," Vasquez said, her voice now almost a whisper. "They live in the dark matter substrate that holds our reality together. They're not made of atoms like you and me. They don't exist in our space. They live in the void between the stars, in the 95% of the universe we all thought was just empty." A shockwave of disbelief and terror rolled through the chamber. Dark matter was just a theory, the cosmic glue that kept galaxies from flying apart. It was something you studied from a safe distance, not a place where things actually lived. Nobody had ever laid eyes on it, much less met a being composed of it. "The Umbra stumbled upon us by pure chance," Vasquez continued. "Our earliest, most basic spacecraft put out energy signals that were one of a kind and very, very loud. They got some unwanted attention." She hit another control. The image flickered, now showing a gorgeous blue and green planet covered in swirling white clouds and cities that twinkled like stars. "Earth," she said. "Our home." First contact happened on September 15th, 2187. Vasquez began, her voice firm. "Picture this. A scout from the dark emptiness of space shows up near our moon. It was curious. It wanted to watch us, to learn what we were all about." Her voice grew hard. "But the Umbra don't think the way we do. They have no concept of the sanctity of life. To them, the physical universe is just primitive. Beneath them. We were nothing more than ants in a jar to them. An interesting distraction, but completely undeserving of any respect." The holographic display changed again. It was Earth, but something was terribly wrong. A dark stain was creeping across the planet's surface. Cities winked out of existence. Whole continents went black. "The Umbra attack was sudden and without warning," Vasquez said. "They poured out of their dark space from dozens of places all at once. Our weapons were completely useless against them. Our shields were like tissue paper. See, they existed in a dimension just slightly out of sync with ours, allowing them to attack from angles that shouldn't even be possible in our reality." Keith stared at the gut-wrenching images. The devastation was total, absolute. He'd seen his share of wars in his long life, but nothing remotely like this. This wasn't a war. "This was a straight-up extermination," Vasquez went on, her voice now flat and empty of all emotion. "In the first 24 hours, we lost 3 billion people. By the end of the first week, half of our entire species was gone. Our military was wiped out. Our governments were in ruins. We were staring extinction right in the face." She stopped, letting the crushing weight of her words sink into the stunned silence of the chamber. "But humanity refused to break," Vasquez declared. "We held on. And then we began to fight back." The image shifted one more time, now showing a laboratory. Scientists were working with a desperate intensity, piecing together bizarre machines and conducting impossible experiments. "The Umbra made one huge mistake," Vasquez explained. "When they attacked, they left behind tiny traces of their technology. Microscopic fragments of dark matter, bits and pieces of their own gear that had fallen out of phase with their dimension. We collected every single fragment we could find. We studied them. We reverse-engineered technology from creatures that should have been completely beyond our understanding." "That's impossible," someone muttered from the crowd. Keith couldn't tell who it was. "You can't reverse-engineer something you can't even comprehend." "We didn't comprehend it," Vasquez admitted. "To be honest, we still don't completely get it. But we learned just enough. enough to construct ships that could partially slip into dark space, enough to build weapons that could actually hurt beings made of dark matter, enough to stay alive. She looked around the chamber, scanning the faces, her eyes locked with Keith's, and in them he saw something that surprised him. It wasn't pride or a sense of victory, but a deep, profound sadness. "The war lasted for 53 years, Vasquez said. 53 years of fighting an enemy we could barely even see. 53 years of losing colonies, ships, and loved ones. By the time it was all over, Earth's population had plummeted from 12 billion down to just 2 billion. Our colonies outside the solar system were all gone. Our once great fleet was nothing but a handful of surviving ships." "But you won," Keith said. He hadn't planned on speaking. The words just came out. "We didn't win," Vasquez corrected him gently. "We survived. There's a world of difference. The Umbra simply left. To this day, we don't know why. Maybe we just became too much trouble to exterminate. Maybe they found a new toy to mess with. Or maybe they just got bored." She touched the control panel, and the screen went black. "That was 164 years ago," Vasquez said. "In the decades since, humanity has rebuilt. We've grown. We've pushed our technology further than ever before, and we have been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Vexnar shot back. "For the Umbra to return." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. An icy dread crawled down Keith's spine, and in that moment, he got it. He finally understood everything. Humanity hadn't come to the Council begging to be saved. They weren't looking for trade deals, alliances, or new technologies. They were here to deliver a warning. "You believe the Umbra are coming back?" Keith asked. "We know they are," Vasquez replied. "The Umbra never truly went away. They are everywhere, woven into the very dark matter that holds this galaxy together. They're watching, they're waiting, and when they finally decide it's time to make their move again, nothing in our normal space stands a chance of stopping them." "Nothing except for your ships," Counselor Marayat added quietly. "Our ships can fight them, yes," Vasquez confirmed, "but we have so few. 47 ships. That's our entire dark matter-capable fleet. It's nowhere near enough to defend a galaxy. It's barely enough to protect what's left of humanity." The chamber instantly erupted into chaos. Ambassadors were shouting questions. Advisors were yelling for more information. Military commanders started bickering about strategies and defenses. The Council's usual calm and orderly process completely disintegrated. Keith just sat there, stunned, his mind racing. The Umbra, creatures made of dark matter, beings from another dimension. The Council couldn't see them, couldn't even begin to understand them. They had nearly wiped humanity from existence. They could easily do the same thing to every race in this room, and the Council had zero defense. All their incredible fleets, their advanced technology, their thousands of years of progress, it was all completely useless. Against the Umbra, they were just as defenseless as humanity was 200 years ago. Silence. The voice cut through the noise like a knife. Keith looked up and saw Grand Chancellor Vortek rising slowly from his throne. He was ancient, even for a Valoran. His scales were a faded gray with age, but his voice still carried an absolute power that commanded respect. The chamber fell silent at once. "Ambassador Vasquez," the Grand Chancellor said, "you have told us about a threat that could destroy everything we have ever accomplished. You have also demonstrated that your people possess the only means of defending against this threat. So I ask you, what is it that you want from us?" Vasquez looked him straight in the eye. "An alliance," she said simply. "A real one. We want to be treated as true equals, not with the condescending deals you hand out to so-called younger races. No more one-sided trade agreements or protection treaties meant to keep us under your thumb. We want a seat at this table as your partners, and in exchange, we will share our technology. Not all of it, and not right away, but enough. Enough to help you start building your own defenses, enough to give you a fighting chance when the Umbra decide to come back." The Grand Chancellor was silent for a long, heavy moment. Keith could practically see the gears turning in his ancient mind. Teaming up with humanity meant treating them as equals, and for the ancient, proud races of the galaxy, that was a tough pill to swallow. It meant ditching the smug superiority they'd enjoyed for centuries and completely rewriting the galactic rulebook. But the only other option was total annihilation. "This is a conversation we must have in private," the Grand Chancellor finally said, his voice heavy. "A decision this huge can't be rushed." "Of course," Ambassador Vasquez said smoothly. "Take all the time you need, but I wouldn't take too long if I were you." "And why is that?" Vasquez simply turned back to the massive holoscreen. With a final tap, a new image flared to life. It was a map of the entire galaxy, a breathtaking web of light showing thousands of stars connected by glowing trade routes. The great civilizations of the Council looked like a brilliant cosmic spiderweb. But out in the empty blackness, in the vast, silent oceans between the stars, something was moving. Tiny energy signatures, faint ripples in space-time, ghostly patterns that had no reason to be there. "Our deep space probes picked these up over the last 6 months," Vasquez explained. "The Umbrella are on the move again. They're watching, and they're getting closer. You could have heard a pin drop in that chamber." "We don't know when they'll make their move," Vasquez went on. "Could be years, could be months, could be tomorrow, but they are coming, and when they do, you're going to have to pick a side." She stepped down from the platform and headed for the exit. At the doorway, she paused and looked back one last time. "Humanity fought the Umbrella by ourselves once before," she said, her voice echoing in the grand hall. "We made it, but it nearly cost us everything. If we have to face them again, we'd really, really rather not do it alone." And with that, she was gone, leaving the most powerful beings in the galaxy in a state of absolute, stunned silence. Keith stared at the map, where the dark, shadowy patterns seemed to throb like a predator getting ready to pounce. He thought about his own people, his home world, and every civilization he'd sworn to protect. All of them could be snuffed out by creatures from another dimension, beings the galaxy's most advanced races couldn't even see. Their only shot was to ask for help from a species they'd always written off as primitive upstarts. The universe was so much stranger than Keith had ever imagined, and way more terrifying. And humanity, the newcomers everyone had so foolishly underestimated, might be the only thing that could save them all. He pushed himself out of his chair and walked over to the chamber's massive viewport. Outside, the strange human ships floated in the void, their dark hulls seeming to shimmer and shift right at the edge of his vision. They looked wrong, impossible. And in that moment, they looked like hope. Keith made his choice. He would go to the Grand Chancellor. He would argue for the Alliance. He would do whatever it took to get ready for the coming storm, because the Umbrella were out there, and the darkness between the stars wasn't empty anymore. The first attack came without a single warning. The colony world of Tari 7 was a quiet, peaceful place, tucked away on the edge of Tasari space, far from the galactic hustle and bustle. 12 million souls called it home, living their lives farming the fertile soil and harvesting the glowing crystal forests the planet was known for. They had never even imagined the horrors of war. They never had a chance to. At dawn on the 4th day of their harvest festival, the sky just went black. Not an eclipse, not a storm. It was something else. Something that bled across the morning sky like a drop of ink in a glass of water. The colonists looked up from their celebrations, their faces turning from joy to confusion, and saw only a curtain of darkness falling. They tried to run, they tried to hide. Didn't matter. The Umbrella washed across the planet like a silent, invisible tsunami. They just appeared out of the dark matter that fills all of space, phasing through walls, energy shields, and reinforced bunkers like they were nothing more than smoke. Normal weapons were useless. Physical barriers meant nothing. They just reached out with shadowy arms and pulled people apart, atom by atom. 12 million lives were snuffed out in just 6 hours. The first sign of trouble the Council had was when the planet's communication network went completely silent. They sent a patrol fleet to check it out. What they found was a ghost world. No bodies, no destroyed buildings, no signs of a fight, just empty cities and quiet forests under a sky that had bizarrely returned to its normal, peaceful blue. It was as if the entire colony on Tari 7 had just been erased. Ambassador Keithall stood in his office, reading the official report for the 3rd time, praying he was just reading it wrong. But the words didn't change. The planet was dead. The Umbrella were back. He immediately called for an emergency meeting. As the other ambassadors walked into the great chamber, their faces were pale masks of shock. Most of them had dismissed Ambassador Vasquez's warning as a scary story meant to trick them. They'd convinced themselves the Umbrella were a human problem, something that would never bother the important parts of the galaxy. They had never been more wrong. "We have confirmed 18 separate attacks in the last month," Admiral Becknar announced, his voice booming as a map of the devastated star systems lit up the room. Every single attack was on the outer fringes, hitting isolated colonies and lonely stations. The total number of lives lost was estimated at 200 million. The number just hung in the air. 200 million people gone. "Our fleets can't even fight them," Becknar continued, his voice hollow with defeat. "The Umbrella don't really exist in our physical space. Our weapons pass right through them. Our shields don't slow them down one bit. It's like trying to fight a shadow with a sword." "Then we need to find different swords," Counselor Mirret cried out, her normally shimmering silver skin now a dull ashen gray. Tari 7 had been her people's newest home. 2 million of them were now gone forever. "There are no different weapons," Becknar snapped back. "Not in any arsenal we have. The Umbrella operate in a dimension we can't even reach. We have no technology that can interact with dark matter. We can't even reliably detect it." "The humans can," Keithal said, his voice quiet but firm. Every single head in the room whipped around to face him. "Ambassador Vasquez warned us this would happen," Keithal reminded them. "She told us they were coming, she told us they were watching, and she told us that humanity had already figured out how to fight them." "The humans are primitives," someone scoffed from the back. "Their fleet is a joke. Their entire population is barely a drop in the ocean compared to ours." "Those primitives took out a Kree battlecruiser without firing a single shot," another ambassador, Cathro, shot back. "Their joke of a fleet survived a war against these exact same monsters. And their drop in the ocean population clawed its way back from the very brink of extinction. I think it's high time we shut up and started listening to them." The chamber fell dead silent. At last, Grand Chancellor Vortex spoke. "Get me Ambassador Vasquez. Tell her the Council requests her presence, immediately." The human ambassador arrived within the hour. She walked into the chamber all by herself, her face serious. She already knew why she was there. She had been waiting for this call. "Ambassadors," she began, her voice perfectly calm. "I really wish we were meeting again under better circumstances." "The Umbrella have come back, just like you predicted," the Grand Chancellor said. "Yes. You said your people could fight them. Is that still true?" "It is." "Then we need your help." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a proposal. It was a complete and total surrender. The most powerful civilizations in the known universe were on their knees, begging a race of newcomers to save them. Vasquez looked around the room, taking in the raw fear, the desperation, and the shattered pride in their eyes. "We will help," she said, "but we have terms." "Name them," the Chancellor replied instantly. "First, humanity is to be recognized as a full and equal member of this council. No more being treated like kids at the adult table. We get an equal vote on everything." "Done," the Grand Chancellor agreed without a second's hesitation. "Second, all military operations in this war will be under a joint Human Council command. We will plan every strategy together. We will share every piece of intel. We fight this war as one united force, or we don't fight it at all." "Done." "And third, when this is all over, humanity will share our dark matter technology with every member of the Council. We'll teach you how to build ships like ours. We will give you the weapons you need to defend yourselves." A shockwave of gasps and whispers rippled through the hall. Sharing technology on that level was absolutely unheard of. It would change the balance of galactic power forever. "And what do you ask in return for this incredible gift?" the Grand Chancellor asked, his voice filled with suspicion. "Nothing," Vasquez said. "We want nothing at all. We're offering this as a free gift, because the only other choice is for every single one of us to go extinct." She let the silence hang in the air, her eyes locking with each of the stunned leaders around the table. Let me be clear. The Umbrial don't do negotiations. They won't sign your treaties. They couldn't care less if you're human or Valoran, Kree, or Tessari. To them, we're all just stuff. We're made of regular matter, and that makes us an infestation. And they will scrub this galaxy clean of us unless we finally get our act together and stand as one. The Grand Chancellor glanced at the other ambassadors, searching their faces. One by one, they gave a slow, heavy nod. "The Council agrees to your terms," he announced, his voice strained. "Welcome to the Alliance, Ambassador Vasquez. Now, for the love of all that's holy, tell us how we fight these monsters." Vasquez tapped a control on her console, and the holographic map in the center of the room shifted to a grand tactical view of the galaxy. "Right now, what you've seen, this isn't the war," she said softly. "This is just the Umbrial poking the hive. These attacks on your outer colonies are just tests. They're checking your defenses, seeing how you react. The real invasion, that hasn't even begun yet." A gruff-scaled ambassador named Vexar slammed his fist on the table. "How can you possibly know that?" Vasquez's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a deep, ancient weariness in them. "Because we've lived this nightmare before. This is exactly how their war against humanity started. Little strikes on isolated worlds. They're trying to make you scared. They want to push you into making mistakes. And once they think you're panicked and broken, they'll hit you with a force you can't even imagine." "So where's the real attack going to be?" Vexar demanded. "We don't know for sure, but we've got some educated guesses." Vasquez highlighted several star systems on the map. "These are the galactic choke points. You control these, you control travel for an entire sector. If the Umbrial want to bring this galaxy to its knees, they'll go for these systems first." "Then we'll defend them with everything we have," Vexar roared. "We will," Vasquez agreed. "But there's something you all need to understand right now." Her face turned deadly serious. "You cannot win a shooting war with the Umbrial. Your fleets are magnificent, powerful. But against creatures made of dark matter, your weapons are like throwing rocks at a hurricane." A murmur of disbelief went through the room. "Then what good are our fleets?" someone asked. "They can save your people," Vasquez replied. "They can run evacuations. They can buy us time." She pointed to the small cluster of icons representing her own fleet. "My ships will do the real fighting. We're the only ones who can take the fight to the Umbrial on their terms. But we need your fleets running interference, pulling survivors out of the fire, and holding the line while we go on the attack." Vexar's scales bristled. "You want our mighty armadas to be a distraction." "I want your mighty armadas to be heroes," Vasquez shot back, her voice ringing with passion. "The people you rescue will tell stories about your crews for generations. They will know that when the darkness came, you were the ones who held it back." Vexar stared at her, his anger slowly replaced by a dawning understanding. He finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Tell us what we need to do." The next 6 months were a blur of coordinated chaos. The Umbrial hit them again and again. They wiped out supply stations and communication arrays. They ambushed patrols in deep space and vaporized research facilities. They would materialize from nothing and fade away moments later. The galaxy had never known an enemy so elusive, so terrifying. But for the first time, the Alliance held the line. Human ships, sleek and black as the void itself, flew wing to wing with the Council's gleaming silver cruisers. They fought in the spaces between spaces, chasing the Umbrial into dimensions that would tear a normal ship apart. And slowly, painfully, they began to push the darkness back. Ambassador Keithall watched the battle reports stream in, day after day. He saw the casualty numbers climb. He saw entire star systems fall, while others were saved by a razor's edge. He watched those human ships take hits that should have turned them into superheated plasma. Their crews fought with a grim resolve that only comes from having faced the end of the world and survived. They had stared into the abyss once before, and they had no intention of letting anyone else fall in. "Ambassador Keithall?" A young officer stood at his door. Keithall looked up from his screen. "Yes? What is it?" "It's the humans, sir. They've called a meeting. They say they've found a way to win. Keithall shot to his feet. A plan. After 6 agonizing months of barely surviving, the humans finally had a real plan. Where? The main strategy room. Ambassador Vasquez is waiting. Keithall practically ran through the station's corridors, dodging nervous clusters of officers and diplomats speaking in urgent whispers. You could feel it in the air, the tension of a coming storm. The Umbrial attacks were getting bolder, more coordinated. They were massing for the final, decisive blow. He burst into the war room to find Vasquez standing before a massive holographic display. The top military minds of the Alliance were gathered around her. Vexar was there, his armored hide practically humming with nervous energy. The elegant Ambassador Moret was there, her usual silver glow looking dull and faded from exhaustion. A dozen other leaders he'd spent months arguing with now stood in grim solidarity. Ambassador Keithall, Vasquez acknowledged him with a nod. Glad you could make it. Your officer said you have a plan, Keithall said, getting straight to the point. Vasquez turned back to the star chart. It showed a desolate patch of space at the galaxy's farthest rim, a place so empty it didn't even have a name. We've been tracking every Umbrial energy signature for months, she began. Their strikes seem random, but they're not. There's a pattern. They're all coming from a single point. She pointed to a spot on the map that looked like any other patch of blackness, but as Keithall stepped closer, he saw a faint, almost invisible distortion, like heat rising off a road on a summer day, but in the fabric of space itself. What is that? He whispered. We're calling it the threshold. It's a wound in reality, Vasquez explained. A tear between our universe and theirs. It's the doorway the Umbrial are using to pour into our galaxy. As long as that doorway stays open, they will never stop coming. This war will never, ever end. Can it be closed? Moret asked, her voice barely audible. We think so, Vasquez said, but it's going to cost us everything. She laid out the plan. The concept was brutally simple, but the execution was a nightmare. The entire Allied fleet, every last ship, would launch a thunderous, overwhelming assault on the Umbrial's staging grounds to draw their full attention. While the enemy was busy fighting the largest fleet ever assembled, the small human fleet would make a suicide run directly at the threshold. They would use their unique technology to slip through the tear and try to collapse it from the other side. If we pull this off, Vasquez concluded, her voice solid as rock, the Umbrial will be severed from our reality for good. They'll be trapped in their own universe, unable to ever cross over again. We'll be safe. And if you don't pull it off? Vexar asked, his voice low. Vasquez's expression didn't change. Then we die trying. Our ships are torn apart between dimensions, and the Umbrial will flood the galaxy with nothing left to even slow them down. The room fell into a deep, profound silence. Every person in that room understood. This was the final gamble. The fate of trillions hinged on this one desperate move. When do we go? Vexar's voice was tight. Tomorrow at dawn, Vasquez replied, her tone absolute. That tear is growing more unstable by the hour. We have days at most before it rips wide open and the full invasion begins. We have to strike first. The commanders shared grim looks. Then, one after another, they nodded their assent. Tomorrow then, Keithall confirmed, his voice a low rumble. May we all be fortunate enough to see the stars again. He knew in his heart that many of them wouldn't, but the only alternative was to surrender and let the galaxy burn. And so, the Allied fleet gathered at the edge of known space. It was a sight that would be sung about for 1,000 years, the largest military force in galactic history. Over 3,000 warships from more than 100 different worlds hung in the blackness, a man-made nebula of light and power. Ancient rivalries were forgotten. Hulking Kree battleships floated beside elegant Valoran cruisers. It was a testament to what they could achieve when united against a common foe. And right at the center of that incredible armada were the 47 ships of the human dark matter fleet, looking like holes punched through the fabric of space. From the bridge of his flagship, Ambassador Keithall watched them. The human ships seemed to vibrate, their outlines blurring as if they existed in multiple places at once. Even now, they filled him with a sense of profound unease. But mixed with that unease was a fragile, growing sense of hope. "All ships report ready, Ambassador," his tactical officer said. "The fleet is at 100% strength." Keithall nodded slowly. Full strength. 3,000 ships against an enemy from another reality. An enemy they couldn't truly hurt. An enemy that had already extinguished hundreds of millions of lives. It felt like they were bringing a bucket of water to a supernova. "Sir, we're receiving a fleet-wide broadcast from the human flagship Prometheus," the officer reported. "Ambassador Vasquez wishes to address the fleet." "Put her on the main screen," Keithall ordered. The giant screen flickered to life, showing Vasquez's calm, determined face. Behind her, the bridge of her ship was a strange and alien place, lit only by the eerie glow of instruments that measured things beyond human comprehension. "Commanders, pilots, soldiers of the Allied fleet," her voice echoed across thousands of bridges. "In a few short hours, we will face the Umbrial at the heart of their power. Many of us will not be returning from this battle. But I give you my word, not a single one of us will die for nothing." She paused, and it felt like her eyes were piercing right through the screen, locking onto every single person listening. 200 years ago, humanity stood against the Umbrial completely alone. We didn't have any allies. We didn't have technology like this. We had no real shot at winning. But we fought anyway, and we survived. We made it because we refused to just lie down and let it happen. Because we chose to fight when everything seemed absolutely hopeless. Her voice surged with passion. Because we believe that life itself is something worth fighting for. But this time, we are not alone. This time, the greatest civilizations this galaxy has ever seen are standing together as one. Today, we're going to show the Umbrial what happens when the children of the light refuse to let the darkness snuff them out. She raised her hand in a way Keithall had never seen before, but he instantly understood what it meant. "For everyone who won't see another sunrise, I salute your courage. For those of you who will live to tell the story of this day, I envy you. And to the Umbrial, who thought they could just show up and shatter us, I've got just one thing to say. You picked the wrong galaxy." The screen cut to black. A deep silence fell over the entire fleet for a long moment. And then from 3,000 ships, a roar started to swell. It wasn't a shout of fear or desperation. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated defiance. Keithall felt it catch fire in his own chest, a flame he thought had gone out a long, long time ago. He was 400 years old, way too old for this kind of emotion, or so he'd thought. "All ships," he said, his own voice now echoing with a new strength across the command channel. "Advance on my signal." The whole fleet began to surge forward like a single entity. An hour later, the threshold pinged on their sensors. You couldn't actually see it with your naked eye, and standard instruments couldn't pick it up at all. But the human ships could see it clear as day, and they shared their sensor data with the rest of the fleet. What Keithall saw on his main screen made his blood run cold. The threshold wasn't some kind of portal. It was a wound torn into the very fabric of space, bleeding pure darkness into our universe. And pouring through that wound came the Umbrial, wave after endless wave of shadowy horrors that warped the laws of physics. They didn't use ships because they didn't need any. They were the darkness, twisted into a horrifying shape with a terrifying mission. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands. It was more than Keithall could have possibly imagined. "By the spirits of our fathers," someone whispered over the comms. "Hold the line." Vasquez's voice cut through the building panic. "The main fleet will engage their front wave, draw their fire, make them focus every last one of them on you. My ships will punch a hole through their lines and make a run for the threshold." "They'll tear us to shreds," Vexnar yelled. His voice was steady, but Keithall could hear the faint tremble of fear just under the surface. "They'll definitely give it their best shot," Vasquez replied instantly. "But they've never faced a fleet this massive. They've never seen the combined might of an entire galaxy united against them. Now go show them what you're made of." With that, the conventional fleet charged ahead and all hell broke loose. The Umbrial were a living tide of shadow, their shapes twisting and changing as they surged toward them. They slipped right through energy shields, as if they were nothing more than air. They brushed off weapons that should have vaporized them. They were a genuine nightmare, exactly like Vasquez had told them. But the fleet didn't buckle. Kree warships locked their hulls together to create a wall of steel and fire, their cannons firing with little effect, but their crews refusing to give up a single inch of space. Valoran cruisers zipped through the mayhem, pulling crews from ships that were being torn to pieces. Tasari science vessels projected bizarre experimental energy fields that actually managed to slow the Umbrial down, if only for a second. Every single species threw everything they had into that battle. And right in the heart of it all, the human dark matter fleet finally went on the offensive. Kethol watched, completely captivated, as the Prometheus and its sister ships dove headfirst into the Umbrial swarm. They didn't fight like anything he'd ever witnessed. It was like they existed in two places at the same time, blinking between realities from one instant to the next. When an Umbrial lunged at them, they would just be gone. But when they fired back, the creatures of darkness had nowhere to hide. Space itself seemed to warp around the human vessels. Waves of pure gravity blasted across the battlefield. The darkness itself seemed to physically shrink back from their assault. For the first time in their horrifying existence, the Umbrial were finding out what it felt like to be afraid. "Push forward," Vasquez ordered. "All dark matter ships, form up on me. We're going in." The 47 human ships pulled into a tight spearhead formation. They rocketed toward the Terran reality, their hulls blazing with an energy no one else could even begin to understand. The Umbrial tried to stop them. Thousands of the shadow beings swarmed the human fleet, smashing against their hulls in a desperate, suicidal attack, and some of them got through. Kethol watched in horror as one of the human ships was simply buried under the assault, its hull ripped open by things from another universe. Then a second ship fell, and then a third, but the others didn't even slow down. "We've lost the Hermes," a steady human voice reported over the comms. "The Athena is taking major damage. The Apollo is gone." "Keep pushing," was all Vasquez said in reply. Her voice was like granite, but Kethol could hear the pain underneath it. Every ship that was lost was a crew she knew by name, friends she had fought alongside, people who had placed their complete trust in her. We're almost at the threshold. "All ships, prepare for phase transition." The human fleet finally made it to the rip between dimensions. And then, they did something that should have been impossible. They vanished. One moment, the remaining human ships were right there, a point of light in the swirling darkness. The next, they were simply gone. Not destroyed, not retreating. They had just disappeared. It was as if they had never existed at all. They had passed through the threshold. The battle raged on all around Kethol, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the empty spot in space where the human fleet used to be. They were on the other side now. Inside the Umbrial's home dimension, fighting a battle nobody else could witness, completely and utterly on their own. The minutes dragged on. Each one felt like a lifetime. The Allied fleet was holding its ground, but they were losing ships by the dozens and couldn't hold out for much longer. The Umbrial were pressing their attack as if they could sense that victory was within their grasp. And then something shifted. The threshold flickered. The stream of darkness pouring out of it seemed to sputter and shrink. Out on the battlefield, the Umbrial suddenly faltered, their attacks becoming clumsy and disorganized. "What's happening?" someone asked over the channel. Kethol didn't respond. He was just staring at the tear in space, watching as it started to get smaller. It began slowly. The edges of the wound started to pull in, like a cut healing itself. The flood of Umbrial forces slowed to a trickle, then stopped. The threshold was closing. "They did it," Kethol whispered, his voice full of awe. "The humans. They're taking it down from the inside." A massive cheer went up across the entire fleet. Ships that had been seconds away from being destroyed suddenly saw their attackers stumble, fade, and even vanish into thin air. The Umbrial, who were stuck on our side of the threshold, were now cut off from their source. They were trapped, they were weak, and they started to die. The Allied fleet ripped into them with a renewed fury. Weapons that had been completely useless just a few moments earlier now blasted the shadow beings to pieces. The monsters that had seemed so unbeatable were suddenly very, very mortal. Within an hour, it was finished. The threshold collapsed in on itself, sealing the wound between the dimensions for good. The last of the Umbrial forces were hunted down and eliminated. The darkness was defeated. The galaxy was safe. But the victory felt empty. As the cheering faded, a heavy silence settled over the fleet as everyone came to the same heartbreaking realization. The human ships never reappeared. Days bled into weeks. Rescue missions were dispatched to the threshold's last known coordinates. They found nothing at all. There was nothing left. No wreckage, no emergency signals, not a single sign of the 47 ships that had given everything to seal the hole between realities. Ambassador Vasquez and her entire fleet were simply gone, consumed by a dimension no one could ever hope to reach. The Galactic Council held a massive memorial service, and every species came to pay their respects, filling the same chamber where Vasquez had first tried to warn them, mourning the heroes who had saved them all. It was Keith who delivered the eulogy. "Humanity came to us as strangers," he started, his voice filling the silent hall. "They were a young race, brand new to the galactic stage, and if I'm being honest, we all looked down on them. We called them primitive, not worthy of having a seat at this very table." He paused, letting the truth of his words sink in. "We were so wrong. Humanity survived a disaster that would have broken any of our own civilizations. They dragged themselves back from the very edge of extinction and rebuilt their entire world from the ashes. And when they could have just stayed hidden, safe in their own little corner of the galaxy, they chose to come and help us instead." Ambassador Elena Vasquez and the crews of the Dark Matter Fleet gave their lives to close that horrifying gateway. They fought an enemy we couldn't even hurt in a place we couldn't even reach. "They saved trillions of souls," the Chancellor's voice boomed, his eyes scanning the Grand Chamber, landing on the faces of ambassadors who once laughed at humanity. He stared down the fleet commanders who had dismissed human technology as a pipe dream, and the galactic leaders who were once too proud to ever ask for help. And they didn't ask for a single thing in return. It's a debt we can never repay, but we will spend our lives honoring their memory. We can honor the lesson they taught all of us. He raised his hand, making the same defiant gesture Captain Vasquez had shown them right before the final charge. "The universe is far darker than we ever wanted to believe. But they proved that even in the deepest, blackest void, something can stand its ground, something can fight back. Humanity showed us how, and we will never, ever forget it." The memorial ended, and the dignitaries silently filed out of the hall. On the outside, everything seemed to be getting back to normal. But nothing was normal. From a panoramic window on the council spire, Ambassador Keith gazed into the endless sea of stars. The human embassy was dark now, its doors sealed. The last of their civilian ships had already jumped back to their home system, cutting humanity off from the galaxy once more. But he knew it was only for a little while. The technology pact was still in place. Scientists from every species in the council were working around the clock, trying to decode the secrets the humans had left behind. In a decade or two, maybe even sooner, other races would have their own void energy fleets. The galaxy would never be helpless again. A soft chime sounded as the door behind him slid open, and a young Valoran aide hurried in. "Ambassador Keith, sir, we're detecting a transmission." "From who?" Keith asked without turning. "That's the thing, sir. We don't know. It's not coming from regular space. Our sensors can't get a lock on its point of origin." A jolt of ice shot through Keith's veins. "Show me, on the main screen." The officer tapped his data pad, and a massive holoscreen flickered to life, filled with swirling static. And then slowly, a face began to emerge from the chaos. It was Captain Elena Vasquez. She looked like she'd been through hell and back, but she was alive. "Ambassador Keith." Her voice was a ragged whisper, breaking in and out. "If you're getting this, then we did it. The tear is sealed for good. The Umbrial can't cross into your dimension ever again." A weak, tired smile touched her lips. "We're still out here. Somewhere. The ships that made it through with us found a stable bubble inside this dark space. We haven't figured out how to get home," she confessed, her voice strained. "But we're trying, and we're still in the fight." The image distorted wildly for a second. Vasquez leaned closer to her camera. "You tell the Council that humanity always honors its promises. We gave you our tech. We helped you save your home, and now we're going to find our own way back." She paused, and for a split second, Keith could see the bridge of her flagship, the Prometheus, behind her. Her crew was a blur of motion at their stations, operating controls that looked like nothing he'd ever seen. "Welcome to the real galaxy, Ambassador," Vasquez said, her voice filled with a powerful, bone-deep exhaustion. "We showed you how to survive in it. Now, you make us proud." And with a final pop of static, the transmission died. Keith stood there in the silence, staring at the empty screen. Outside, the stars glittered with a brilliant, clean light. The darkness between them was finally just darkness, empty of the monsters that had threatened to swallow everything. But he knew that somewhere out there, in a place beyond his reach, humans were still fighting, still surviving, and still stubbornly refusing to give up. A genuine smile finally spread across his face. Some species were just too bullheaded to know when they were beaten.